Greek and Hebrew Matthew, a comparison. Introduction, the alternate code of the first gospel. For nearly 2 millennia, the history of early Christianity has been viewed almost exclusively through a Greek lens. The New Testament Gospels, as they have come down to us in the standard canonical tradition, were written, edited, and preserved in the Greek language. However, an intriguing historical critical mystery persists. Did a more primitive Hebrew language layer of the gospel tradition manage to survive beneath the surface of history? By examining the ancient testimonies of the Church Fathers alongside a remarkable medieval document, a clearer picture emerges of what is known as Hebrew Matthew. This text is not merely a translation of the familiar New Testament book. It represents a distinct, parallel textual tradition. When contrasted with the canonical Greek Matthew, it offers a foggy but fascinating window back into a lost, primitive form of the faith, one deeply rooted in its original Jewish context and structurally distinct from the Gentile-focused theology that ultimately came to dominate the Western world. What is Hebrew Matthew and its relationship to the canonical text? In the study of Christian origins, Hebrew Matthew refers to a textual tradition of the Gospel of Matthew, written in the Hebrew language. It stands apart from the canonical Greek Matthew found in modern Bibles. For centuries, the standard academic consensus held that the Gospel of Matthew was originally composed in Greek, utilizing the Gospel of Mark and a lost saying source known as Q. However, a closer look at the actual text of Hebrew Matthew reveals a far more complex relationship with the canonical version. It is not an exact duplicate. Instead, it presents a fascinating mix of overlapping material and radical structural deviations. Systemic similarities. At its core, Hebrew Matthew follows the same basic narrative arc as the canonical Greek text. It chronicles the genealogy of Jesus, his birth, his baptism by John, his Galilean ministry, the gathering of his 12 disciples, his teachings, such as the Sermon on the Mount, his journey to Jerusalem, his crucifixion, and his post-resurrection appearance. Structurally, the chapters generally align, meaning a reader familiar with Greek Matthew can easily navigate the corresponding sections of the Hebrew version. Radical differences. Despite sharing a common narrative skeleton, the differences in specific readings are profound, particularly regarding theology, geography, and the scope of Jesus' mission. The Trinitarian formula and the Gentile mission. The most explosive divergence occurs at the very end of the Gospel, in Matthew chapter 28, 19-20. In the canonical Greek Matthew, the risen Jesus delivers the Great Commission, telling his disciples, "Go therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." In the Hebrew Matthew tradition, the Trinitarian baptismal formula is entirely absent, as is the explicit command to convert the Gentile nations. Instead, the Hebrew text reads, "Go and teach them to carry out all the things which I have commanded you forever." This reading strips away the late Hellenistic ecclesiastical framework and restores a purely Jewish master-disciple dynamic, a rabbi instructing his pupils to preserve and teach his commandments. The mountain of resurrection. In the Greek text of Matthew 28:16, the disciples go to the mountain where Jesus had directed them, though no prior instruction is recorded in the Gospel. The Hebrew text resolves this narrative gap with a striking geographic detail, noting that they went to the mountain where they had prayed. This explicitly links the resurrection appearance to the Mount of Transfiguration, preserving an older, localized geographic memory. The nature of doubt. In the same resurrection scene, Greek Matthew notes that when the disciples saw Jesus, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Without a direct pronoun, Greek interpreters often argue that the disciples merely had weak faith. The Hebrew text adds precision, explicitly stating, "But some doubted him," framing the doubt as relational and centered on his transformed identity, rather than an abstract crisis of belief. Textual affinities with lost sources. Intriguingly, Hebrew Matthew frequently matches the readings of Codex Sinaiticus, the 4th century Greek manuscript discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery, rather than the later Byzantine text type that formed the basis of the King James Bible. Furthermore, it contains unique parallels to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Thomas, and Luke's specific version of the Q source, readings that were entirely lost to mainstream Western antiquity until modern archaeology recovered them. The ancient testimony and origins of the text. The idea of a Hebrew language Matthew is not a modern invention. It is anchored in the earliest recorded traditions of the Christian Church. Between the 2nd and 4th centuries, multiple church historians and theologians explicitly stated that Matthew wrote his gospel in the native dialect of the Jewish people. Papias of Hierapolis, c. 60 to 130 AD. Our earliest witness, Papias, was a second-generation figure said to be a companion of John. He famously noted that Matthew collected the oracles, teologia, in the Hebrew language, and each interpreted them as best he could. This has led to intense historical speculation. Did Matthew originally write a full narrative gospel, or did he compile a collection of Jesus' sayings similar to the Q source or the Gospel of Thomas? Irenaeus of Lyons, c. 130 to 202 AD, writing around the 170s, Irenaeus asserted that Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. Origen, c. 184 to 253 AD, and Eusebius, c. 260 to 339 AD. Origen noted that the first gospel was published by Matthew, the former tax collector, who composed it in the Hebrew language for those from Judaism who came to believe. Eusebius echoed this, stating that Matthew wrote his gospel in his native tongue just before traveling to preach to other nations. Epiphanius and Jerome, 4th century AD. By the 4th century, Epiphanius noted that a version of this Hebrew text was actively used by the Ebionites, a group of early Jewish Christians who championed Peter, strictly observed the Torah, and rejected Paul as an apostate from the law. Jerome similarly claimed to have consulted a Hebrew Matthew and a Gospel of the Hebrews in the library at Caesarea. The transmission, how the text survived. If the early church fathers knew of a Hebrew Matthew, how did it disappear from the canonical landscape? When the Roman armies destroyed Jerusalem and its temple in 70 AD, the original, Torah-observant Jewish Christian core was fractured and scattered. As the church rapidly shifted to a Gentile-dominated, Greek-speaking demographic, the Hebrew texts were largely forgotten, sidelined, or branded as heretical by an increasingly dogmatic ecclesiastical hierarchy. However, the text did not perish. It survived as an underground document preserved within isolated Jewish communities. Primitive Hebrew tradition, Logia. The primary, complete manuscript available to modern scholars survived through a highly unusual historical channel, Medieval Jewish anti-Christian polemics. Around the year 1400, a Jewish physician living in Spain, named Rabbi Shem-Tob ben Isaac ben Shaprut, wrote a comprehensive apologetic work titled Even Bohan, the Touchstone or Smooth Stone. During this period, Spanish Jews were frequently forced by Christian authorities to engage in public theological debates, such as the famous disputations. To arm his fellow rabbis with the textual tools needed to defend their faith against Christian missionary efforts, Shem-Tob transcribed the entire Gospel of Matthew into his book chapter by chapter, followed by a detailed rabbinic refutation of Christian dogma. To ensure his critiques were accurate, Shem-Tob did not simply translate the Latin Vulgate or Greek texts into Hebrew on the spot. Instead, he utilized an existing, ancient Hebrew text type that had been quietly preserved in Jewish circles for generations. In modern times, biblical scholar George Howard of the University of Georgia meticulously isolated this gospel text from Shem-Tob's commentary, publishing it in a landmark critical edition. Through rigorous linguistic analysis, Howard demonstrated that Shem-Tob's text is filled with ancient Hebrew idioms, internal puns, and wordplays that only function in the Hebrew language. It is not a backward translation from Greek or Latin. It is an independent, authentic branch of the Matthew tradition that bypassed the editorial control of the Roman Church entirely. Conclusion: a polish on the foggy window. Ultimately, studying Hebrew Matthew is like looking through a foggy window into the 1st century. It is not completely pristine, and centuries of manuscript transmission have left their marks. Yet, by polishing the text here and there, we catch a rare glimpse of a primitive, structurally distinct variant of the Jesus movement, one that existed before the institutional gatekeepers rewrote the code of Western history. It challenges us to look past centuries of composite church traditions and confront the raw, unedited architecture of the earliest gospel message.